This episode is brought to you by our friends at Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. CBTS exists to provide ministerial training in the context of a confessional local church. They are, among other things, confessional, Baptist, affordable, and accessible. They are also now fully accredited by the Association of Reformed Theological Seminaries. You can learn more about them at their website, which is cbtseminary.org. Again, that is cbtseminary.org.
The Covenant Podcast exists to discuss doctrine, theology, and the biblical worldview from a covenantal Baptist perspective. We pray that this resource will be edifying to you and glorifying to the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, let's get started. Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. We want to welcome back a friendly visitor, Wade Lentz, who is quickly becoming a regular contributor to the Covenant Podcast. I want to encourage you to go back and listen to some of the episodes we've done with him on expository preaching and sermon delivery. Just for a quick way of introduction, Wade has been blessed to pastor 4 different churches over the past 20 years. For the past 6 years, Wade has been the pastor of the church where he grew up, Beryl Baptist Church in Vilonia, Arkansas. And as much as he loves being a pastor, Wade has never lost his love for music and singing. In the year 2000, Wade formed a part-time group called Canaanland, which consisted of his wife, Amanda, his brother Lee, along with Ronnie, LaCaze, and Curt, Crook. Wade is a husband, a father, a pastor, a bass singer, and an expositor of Scripture. Brother Wade, we want to welcome you to the podcast today to talk about the topic of bivocational ministry. So welcome to the podcast again.
Well, thank you guys for having me. It's always a joy, and I count it an honor to be with you guys on this podcast.
Yes, as Austin said, thank you again, Wade, for coming on. The first question we want to ask as we're talking about bivocational ministry is, what does it mean to be in bivocational ministry, or what does that mean?
Well, very simply, it is bivocational pastor has all the responsibilities of a full-time pastor, just part-time pay, and so it is a pastor who works in the secular field full-time, and then pastors as well, and just getting part-time pay. So that's basically what a bivocational pastor is. It's a pastor who has a secular job, full-time job, and then pastors a church.
And we want to talk with you about this topic because you and I have mentioned that you do have some experience in bivocational ministry. So can you tell our audience about some of your experiences in bivocational ministry, and how long were you in bivocational ministry?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, this topic really is near and dear to my heart because I was a bivocational pastor for about 15 years. And so I understand the hardships and the heartaches of being a pastor while working a full-time job. And the particular job that I had, I didn't have banker's hours. I didn't have an 8-to-5 job. I worked for a utility company, and it was the natural gas company. And especially this time of the year, there were long hours. There were several nights where I would be working or get called out. I can remember several times, having to miss on a Wednesday night, having to call somebody at the church and said, "Hey guys, I've got an emergency. I can't make it tonight. You're going to fill in." And then working all night Saturday night and having to preach on Sunday morning. So I know what bivocational pastoring is. And so again, this is very near and dear to my heart, and I do have a heart for just bivocational pastors. I'm praying that this podcast would be an encouragement to someone to keep going and to keep serving, because it can get very, very difficult at times.
How long were you in bivocational ministry? You said 15 years?
Yes, for about 15 years, I pastored churches and worked. And as I said, I started out in my job with very little responsibility. Okay. So it wasn't very taxing on me physically and mentally, but the longer I stayed at my job, the more responsibility they gave me. And it soon became, of course, working in the natural gas industry is a dangerous job at times. And so that was a little different element that maybe the average bivocational pastor doesn't have to go through. But yeah, I did that for about 15 years.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I've never been bivocational, and so I can imagine some of the hardships and difficulties and struggles that come through those experiences. But one thing that I'm interested to hear your thoughts about, and maybe you have some encouragements to bivocational ministers in this regard, is what is the sermon preparation experience like whenever you are bivocational?
Well, that is, it's very difficult. A typical week for me was my sermon prep would start. I'd come home from work on Monday, and I would play with my kids. I had 2 small kids at the time, see them just for a little bit, and I'd go straight into my office in my home and stay in there for a few hours on Monday night. Tuesday night, the same thing. Of course, Monday and Tuesday, you're trying to prepare for a Wednesday message. And then Thursday night, you have to begin preparing for Sunday's message. And so you do that on Thursday and Friday. And then Saturday was cram day, because you only have, at the most 2 hours, possibly 3 hours a night, but normally not even that much because of just the family atmosphere and all that's going on with your own family. So Saturdays were really very hectic and trying to finish virtually 2 sermons on Saturday. And then, of course, Sunday afternoon, very rarely did I have all my sermon preparation done on that Saturday for my Sunday evening service. So Sunday afternoon, it was still preparing for that Sunday evening service. And so, again, with being a bivocational pastor, you're still having to preach all the same sermons and same services that a full-time pastor has. You just don't have as much time to prepare. And so you really have to utilize the time that you have. And the thing is, guys, that comes at a cost. And that cost is, for me, my family. And I cannot tell you the times that on Saturdays when my wife would want to go to the park and, do some hiking or something, where I would have to stay home. And she would go with my mother-in-law or whatever. But I missed a lot of times, and my wife would be the first one to tell you that I missed a lot in my oldest children's life because of the bivocational ministry. And a lot of that I put on myself, but a lot of that was just the nature of the ministry that I was in. So sermon prep is a very difficult thing to do, and you have to stay constant at it. There's just no room for missing a night or two, or you'll find yourself in a mess quick.
Mm. Do we have any scriptural examples of bivocational ministers, and how would you, or how do you believe we can reconcile bivocational ministry with passages like 1 Timothy 5:17?
Right, right. Well, we could say that the Apostle Paul was a bivocational pastor, in that, he made tents and so forth. Of course, he chose that for himself. He did not want to burden the church. But the difference in what the Apostle Paul did is that he could do things, do his work on his time, and he didn't have a boss to say, "Hey, we need this done at this hour," so he could work on his own time. But that would be a one example. And there's others in there that most of the men in those days, I believe, had other, whether it was fishing or whatever, that they did to help compensate the income for them and their family. As far as 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 17, that is a very good scripture, and obviously one that needs to be, that churches need to take serious. It's just that some churches are so small that they really cannot do as much as other churches are able to do. So if the church is doing all that it can, and maybe even above, then I believe they're staying correct on that text, and not trying to change the pastor in any way, but doing everything they can, whether that's $150 a week or $300 a week. And there's other ways to pay, honor, and it's not talking just monetarily, but a church, especially bivocational churches, need to pay double honor to their pastor in that of respect and reverence, because of all that he's doing. They need to take some extra time and to invest in their pastor, because he is investing so much into them. So it's more than just monetarily. This double honor also speaks about much more respect than maybe other elders that may be in the church, because this is the preaching pastor, the preaching elder. So that would be my answer to those questions there.
What are some of the biggest difficulties of being bivocational? I know you've alluded to them, so if you can, if you're willing to, can you flush those out a little more?
Yeah, the biggest difficulties is what I experienced was mental and physical fatigue. When I started pastoring in my early 20s and working, that was not as big as a factor. But when I hit my middle 30s and I was still working a lot of hours, and the church was growing, and so there was more responsibilities on both ends of my life, I got very physically tired and mentally tired, and that is not a good thing. To be honest with you, the second church that I pastored, the church in El Paso, Arkansas, I, looking back and looking at all the situation that I was going through at the time, I was just plumb burnout. I was burnt out. And I didn't see that as much at the time going through it. But looking back, I can see, man, I was just burnt out. And so that's one of the disadvantages that you really have to guard yourself against, is being pulled at so many different directions that you will, really limit your ministry in the long run.
What are some of the advantages of being a bivocational pastor?
Well, there are some advantages. And I would think maybe one advantage would be that the pastor doesn't have to be nearly as concerned about with church budgets, because sometimes full-time pastors are constantly concerned about that because the bulk of the church budgets may be going to his income. So he's concerned about, okay, wow, if we lose more members, or if we lose more income, they may have to dock my pay, or they may have to put me in part-time uh, position. So that's not a concern with bivocational. So you as a pastor, you've got security, maybe more security, because you know that, hey, if the church, votes you out, you're not going to be on the streets. You have a job, you have a way to take care of your family. So in those ways, that can be an advantage than maybe what a full-time pastor has to go through. And with that, you do have more liberty, seemingly, to take a church in a direction that you feel it needs to go, because you're not as fearful as, hey, if you do this and do that, we're going to vote you out. Well, if you vote me out, I still have a job and so forth. So you're not near as fearful to do those things, and so that is an advantage that one can see as if they are a bivocational pastor.
Some good thoughts. Moving our conversation forward, in Dr. James Renahan's book, Edification and Beauty, he gives some examples of some 17th century English particular Baptists that were bivocational. He writes that Keach, Knowles, Kiffin, and Cox all supplemented their income with secular employment, as did other men in other places. And one can see the difficulty inherent in their lives of these ministers. So this isn't something that's just new to our century. It is difficulty that other pastors have had to deal with throughout church history. Following that, can you think of any other bivocational ministers throughout church history?
I really cannot, especially not in modern times. I cannot think of one that was a known or prominent bivocational pastor. I'm sure there are, but I cannot think of one. And I'm curious to know what Benjamin Keach did and these other guys did outside of their ministry, and because what may be different in their time and our time is that today, if you're a bivocational pastor, you are working for another man. Normally, you have to work in a factory or work for a corporation where they dictate to you your hours, when you can take off, and all of those aspects there that make it more difficult than what Keach did or what these other particular Baptists did in the 17th century. But I do not know anybody currently, or even down through the American history, that was a prominent bivocational pastor. And just let me say this concerning bivocational pastors is that you are not second-class pastors, and sometimes it's know that if we when I was a bivocational pastor, and if I went to a Bible conference or went to an associational meeting, and you're sitting around with other men who are pastoring in larger churches, and they're talking about all the things that they're able to do, these different events that they're able to attend, you can feel rather inferior. You can feel rather insignificant, thinking, okay, well, I'm pastoring a church of 30, and I have to work full time. I don't, and you can be grieved at that, but don't ever consider yourself second class. God has called you. There is a great need for your ministry. And so I always, that's why I want to encourage these guys, because I know what it's like, and you want to so badly. I had such a desire to be in the full-time ministry, but I had to wait on the Lord. And in that time, while I was working out in the secular field, the Lord was preparing me. He was preparing me. And so, to be quite honest, I wasn't ready to pastor full time when I was 23. The Lord was having to do his work of sanctification in me and growing me until I was 36 years old. And so everybody's journey is different. And if you are in the bivocational ministry, enjoy the journey. Enjoy the journey. And that is what God has called you. And that's where God has called you, and you bloom where you are planted.
Amen to all that, for sure. Kind of piggybacking off that, you gave some encouragement to bivocational minister themselves. What encouragement do you have to give to churches or members of churches that have bivocational pastors?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I would say to churches to really love your pastor, and make that known to him that he is very much appreciated, that he is well loved. And again, we're not talking about just about monetary gifts, but do special things for him, whether it is having some type of a special recognition. Be helpful to him in allowing him to have some off days, some off Sundays. Where I messed up as a bivocational pastor, I felt like I had to do everything all the time. And it really hurt me in the long run. And I felt like, wow, if I did have some men in the church who could have preached for me on Sunday nights occasionally and Wednesday nights occasionally, but I felt so much pressure that, the church has called me to be the pastor. They're paying me, though part-time, they're paying me to be the pastor. And so I felt like that I had to, where the church should understand that the pastor needs to have some breaks. He's got to have some rest. And so I would encourage churches to allow that. Don't be such a stickler to saying, you're going to teach here on Sunday night, Wednesday night, regardless. Open yourself up to allowing other men in your church to fill in those slots if the pastor needs them.
This next question wasn't a part of the original ones, but just thinking about the topic, I was bivocational for a whopping month, and I know that it was not fun during that time, even though it did reap many benefits for my own soul. But the question is, what can pastors like myself or Austin or yourself who aren't bivocational and are now currently full-time do to encourage and support ministers who are bivocational that they know?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do have a young man that I try to encourage often, and that is just me calling him, taking him out to lunch, making myself available to him for if he has any advice or if he has, any difficulties in his church, he knows that he can call me. sometimes when you're a bivocational, you feel like, well, I don't have anything in common with other full-time pastors, and you don't feel like you can just call anybody. And so I wanted to make myself available to this young man to where he felt like that, though I was not bivocational, hey, I know what you're going through. I know the different difficulties that you have. So just find those guys and invest in them, because you know the difficulties that they're going through. They have the same burdens that a full-time pastor has, and but yet they don't have as much time as they would like, maybe, to study and to shepherd the church and to love the people. The biggest difference that I saw in me becoming full-time pastor, and this is something that my church saw very quickly, was that my sermons got much deeper, and they were much better delivered, much more content to them. I had church members come to me and say, Brother, wow, we can tell a difference between, your bivocational sermons and your full-time ministry sermons. One of the big differences is that now I'm giving myself fully to the ministry, and I'm able to study more and able to dig more. And so that's I would say, again, just find those guys, encourage them, let them know that there is a great need for their ministry. There's a lot of small churches that just cannot pay full time.
This last question we typically reserve for book recommendations. And I personally don't know many books related to the topic that we're discussing today. Brother Wade, if you have some books that you want to recommend, you're more than welcome to. But for the sake of this question, let's not just limit it to books. Maybe podcasts or people, or maybe events that you know about. What are some resources, or maybe even people that you know that would be willing to help with the topic of bivocational ministry to those who are in need?
Right. There are several books. I just looked the other day and jotted down some different books out there. Now, I have not read them. I'm not familiar with the authors of them, but there's one in particular called "Serving as a Bivocational Pastor" by James Hyland. There's a resource there. There's another one by Dennis Bickers, "The Art and Practice of Bivocational Ministry," and so there are some books out there, and these are rather new, but some helps out there that a bivocational can no doubt benefit from by reading these books. And what was your second part of that question?
Any other resources besides books, maybe podcasts or conferences that you know of bivocational ministers, or even people that are like yourself that are helpful in bivocational ministry,
Sure.
counseling with others?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any special bivocational conferences. There may be some out there, but if I was a bivocational pastor, I would surround myself with other men. Don't cut yourself off. And I know time is a big restraint sometimes, but try to get involved as much as you can. Surround yourself with some godly men, whether they are bivocational pastors or they're full-time pastors. And the biggest danger with a bivocational pastor is that they do not have time to attend conferences. They don't have time to attend associational meetings. A lot of times they get left out. And so just do your best to surround yourself with some good, solid men that will encourage you in the faith and in the ministry.
We have been discussing Bi-Vocational Ministry with Wade Lentz. Thank you again for coming on, Wade.
My pleasure.
As usual, this episode is brought to you by our friends at Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. CBTS exists to provide ministerial training in the context of a confessional local church. They are, among other things, confessional, Baptist, accessible, and affordable, and accredited. You can learn more about them at cbtseminary.org. Again, that is cbtseminary.org.
Thank you for listening to the Covenant Podcast. If you've enjoyed this resource, or you simply like the Covenant Podcast, head on over to our iTunes page, subscribe, and leave us a review. We are also available via Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, and Podbean. Thank you for listening to the Covenant Podcast. Grace and peace to you.